Clara Bell worked the counter at the general store down in Harmony Creek, which was the same place as the post office, the same place as the only gas pump, and the only place that sold ice cream past 9 at night. The summer sun had already ironed the air flat, making the dust motes dance slow and golden in the narrow shaft of light slanting through the front window. Clara was turning 30 that year, and the biggest adventure she'd had so far was the time she drove all the way to Jackson just to buy a pair of fancy shoes she never actually wore. Her days spun out like thin, sweet tea, predictable and cool. That was until the morning the letter came in. It wasn't marked properly, having slipped its route somewhere north of the county line, and ended up in the stack for unclaimed or unclear. The envelope was thick, cream-colored paper, sealed with a proper wax stamp. A thing you just didn't see anymore, especially not in Harmony Creek where folks used email for lottery results and nothing else. The address scrawled across the front was simple enough. L.M. General Delivery. The handwriting, however, was what stopped Clara's breath. It wasn't the hurried scribble of bills or the looping cursive of Miss Elspeth's weekly church bulletin. This was careful, deliberate script, like each word had been considered, tasted, before it was set to paper. Curiosity, that sly old snake, wrapped itself around Clara's ankles, tightening with every slow tick of the old brass clock behind the counter. She turned the letter over and over, feeling the weight of it, the promise of something secret. The letter lay on her kitchen table that evening, a beacon in the dim light of her little house. The scent of vanilla from the wax seal was faint but distinct, an aroma of faraway libraries and old promises. She had spent the afternoon failing to find an L.M. who fit the romantic grandeur of the envelope. Lila Mae Thompson was 92 and hadn't seen a letter since the Korean War. Lucy May was 8 and only received birthday cards. No, this letter, this sealed package of someone's heart, wasn't for them. And so, with a sudden, breathless movement, Clara slid a thin letter opener beneath the wax seal, the small, quiet rip sounding deafening in the stillness of her kitchen. What unfolded was not just a note, but an entire world. The writer, who signed himself simply Elias, did not speak of the weather or town gossip. He spoke of the unbearable geometry of longing, the way the moonlight fell on the old magnolia tree outside his window and made him think of eternal things, and a loneliness that tasted like iron and salt. He wrote, "The great tragedy of the soul, my dear, is that it is born knowing the shape of its missing half." It was prose that punched the air right out of Clara's chest. This was not a love letter, not exactly. It was a shared philosophy, a deep, agonizing recognition of another soul. He talked about books she loved but had never dared to mention to anyone in Harmony Creek, the kind that made you feel like you were the only reader left on Earth. He detailed a plan to meet, cryptic and private, involving an old oak tree near the river bend and a certain time next week. The whole thing made the walls of her small house seem to stretch, giving Clara a sudden, dizzying view of the vast, unexplored space within her own heart. She read it once, twice, a third time, running her fingers over the careful ink, the words burning themselves into her memory like scripture. She realized, with a sickening lurch of discovery, that she hadn't just accidentally opened a piece of mail. She had accidentally fallen in love with a ghost. The next few days passed in a haze of stolen glances at the letter and distracted work at the store. Clara kept turning the phrase over in her mind, the shape of its missing half. Elias wrote with a devastating honesty that shattered the polite silence of her own life. She felt seen by a man who had never seen her. The problem wasn't just that she knew his secrets. The problem was that she now knew her secrets, the ones she hadn't even admitted to herself. The sharp, aching desire for something more than Harmony Creek. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday, beneath the old, lightning-scarred oak by the Styx River Bend, known locally as the Sentinel. Clara knew this tree well. It stood alone on a small rise, overlooking the sluggish, dark water. The sheer impossibility of the situation was its own addictive narcotic. She couldn't go, of course. That letter wasn't for her. But the thought of Elias sitting there, waiting, his own soul laid bare in ink, for a missing half that was never going to show up, it felt like a cruelty she couldn't bear to inflict. Who was Lila Mae? Why did she command such beautiful attention? Clara started her own quiet investigation. She had access to the postbox records, the electoral rolls, and the old land deeds. The name Elias Vance was nowhere. The name L.M. was a dead end. This suggested they were either recent arrivals or Elias was traveling through, perhaps renting a cabin off the main road, a common thing for artists or writers seeking solitude in the Deep South. The mystery only deepened the emotional hold he had over her. She imagined him as rugged but gentle, his hands stained with ink, his eyes full of that same lonely recognition he wrote about. She spent an hour in the back room, examining the wax seal again. It wasn't a family crest. It was a small, crudely rendered image of a single star falling. It felt like a sign, a private language spoken only in wax and careful script. Clara knew, the emotional weight of the letter had already begun to alter Clara's perception of her small world. The familiar scent of pine cleaner and stale coffee in the general store now felt thin and insufficient, like a curtain that had been pulled aside to reveal a more vivid reality just beyond the dusty shelves. She noticed the shadows differently, the way the wind hummed a low, sad tune through the screen door. Elias's words, about the geometry of longing, were a lens she now saw her whole life through. She started walking the back roads after the store closed, the letter tucked inside the pocket of her sundress, feeling the crisp paper crinkle against her hip like a small, stolen heart. Miss Elspeth, the unofficial keeper of all Harmony Creek's comings and goings, noticed the change in Clara. "You look like you swallowed a secret, child," she drawled one afternoon, leaning conspiratorially over the candy counter, her eyes sharp as glass shards. Clara just smiled a tight, small smile that revealed nothing. The conflict between the quiet life she had and the tumultuous life the letter offered was now a constant, low-level thrum in her chest. She found herself trying to embody the L.M. that Elias wrote to, a woman of deep, reflective passion, someone capable of inspiring such devotion. She wore a dress she hadn't worn in years, a deep indigo color that matched the ink in his letter. She read a collection of esoteric poetry he mentioned, her mind struggling to grasp the concepts but her spirit resonating with the mood. This wasn't just about meeting a man. It was about meeting the self that Elias believed existed. It was a dangerous, exhilarating act of self-creation, built on a beautiful foundational lie. The day of the meeting was now only 48 hours away, and Clara had already decided. She was going. She had to. The risk of heartbreak was nothing compared to the slow, certain death of curiosity. She just needed a better reason than morbid curiosity to justify her actions. And the simple truth was she had none. The truth was, she was selfishly in love with a possibility. The day arrived draped in a humid, oppressive stillness, the kind of heat that presses down on the soul and makes every movement feel weighted with significance. Clara closed the store early, citing a fictitious appliance repair, and drove her old Ford pickup down the winding dirt road toward the river bend. The sentinel oak was even more imposing up close, its branches thick and gnarled, reaching out over the sluggish, tea-colored water like ancient, welcoming arms. Clara parked out of sight, deep in a cluster of sweet gums, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was wearing the indigo dress, and she had tucked the letter itself into the small pocket hidden inside her skirt, a talisman of her deceit. As she approached the tree, she saw him. He wasn't the rugged, ink-stained artist of her imagination, though he was handsome in a deeply unsettling way. He was tall, dressed simply in dark trousers and a clean white shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, not from writing, but from work. His hair was dark and slightly too long, and he stood with a kind of deep-rooted stillness that made him seem like another part of the landscape. When he turned, his eyes met hers, and they were the color of deep river silt, warm but guarded, and utterly, immediately familiar. It was Elias. He didn't smile, but a shadow of recognition passed over his face, a flicker of something she had only read in his words. "L.M.?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, like a well-worn piece of leather. It was not a question, but a statement of hope and weary certainty. And that was the moment the lie became real. Clara took a breath, the humid air thick in her lungs, and committed the unforgivable sin. "Hello, Elias," she said, letting the words hang in the air, a beautiful, deceptive chime. She saw relief wash over him, a deep, primal easing of tension, and that relief, built on her lie, was her first intoxicating taste of power. Elias studied her, not with suspicion, but with a profound, quiet intensity that made Clara feel exposed, yet simultaneously shielded by the false identity she had just claimed. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, stepping closer, his presence radiating a kind of solitary heat. The instructions were vague. Clara felt the blood rush to her cheeks. She had to think fast, to speak the language of the letter, the shared understanding he had established with the real L.M. "Clarity," she said, recalling a passage about the necessary ambiguity of the soul's journey, "is often a burden. Sometimes the truth is best revealed in shadow." Elias's eyes widened fractionally, a small, genuine smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. "Ah," he breathed, a sound of deep satisfaction. "It is you." In that moment, Clara knew the depth of the deception she was weaving. It wasn't just a misidentification. It was an emotional forgery. She was stealing a connection that belonged to another, simply because she was the one who had read the blueprint. They began to talk, standing beneath the great sentinel, and Elias's conversational style was exactly like his writing. Philosophical, probing, and utterly devoid of small talk. He spoke of the difficulty of finding a soul who understood that life wasn't just about doing things, but about seeing things. He talked about the way the light fractured through the leaves, comparing it to the broken promises of memory. Clara simply listened, occasionally offering a phrase or a quote from the letter, which he took as proof of their intellectual and spiritual bond. Every word he spoke was a drop of pure, clear water to her parched spirit, but every word she uttered was a fresh knot in the web of deceit. The conflict had moved from external suspense to internal, a raging battle between the desire for this transcendent connection and the crushing weight of the truth she held hostage. The following weeks were a dizzying, beautiful blur. Clara and Elias met almost daily, always in secret, always in out-of-the-way places. The crumbling pier on the lake, the back pew of the deserted old church, or simply sitting in the dusty silence of his rented cabin, which turned out to be a small, forgotten fishing shack 10 miles outside of town. He was a writer, a poet, and a former professor who had left the chaos of the North for the profound, quiet despair of the South, seeking a muse and, apparently, his L.M. The emotional intensity of their connection was relentless. Elias believed he had found the one person on earth who mirrored his internal life perfectly, and he was not afraid to share the deepest parts of himself. He would read Clara his new work, his voice rich and melodic, describing dreams that felt like half-forgotten histories and passions that felt too vast for a single lifetime. Clara, for her part, had become a virtuoso of selective truth. She answered his philosophical inquiries by recalling lines from the original letter, or by expressing feelings that the letter had unlocked within her. The risk was constant. She lived in fear that he would ask a specific question about an old memory with L.M. that she couldn't answer. To combat this, she subtly steered the conversation away from the past and into the immediate, intoxicating present of their shared thoughts. The genuine nature of her emerging personality was the creative synergy in action. She wasn't just acting. She was becoming the woman who could hold a conversation with Elias Vance. This new Clara was sharper, more reflective, and dangerously happy. Yet the subconscious knew the truth. Every time he called her my L.M., a cold dread would coil in her stomach, a bitter aftertaste to the sweetest wine. She had to find out who the real Lila May was, and fast, because the entire beautiful edifice of her new life was built on a crumbling foundation of misdirected mail. The first tangible clue to the real L.M. came not from Elias, but but from a forgotten detail in the original letter. In the second paragraph, Elias mentioned L.M.'s affinity for a specific, antique kind of rose-hip tea that was only sold at a specialty goods store in Meridian 40 miles away. Clara realized that a person deeply in love, writing such a heartfelt letter, would naturally send a gift. She asked Elias, in an offhand manner, if L.M. had received the tea he'd mentioned sending. He looked momentarily confused, a shadow passing over his face. Tea? No, I never sent any tea. I mentioned your fondness for it in my first letter, the one before the one you received. Clara's heart sank, then leaped with panic and opportunity. This meant there was a first letter, a letter that had been successfully delivered to the real L.M. This meant the original recipient was still out there, somewhere, and she had received contact from Elias before Clara's accidental intervention. Her immediate thought was the discovery of Lila Mae Carson's identity did two things simultaneously. It grounded the fantasy, and it escalated the conflict into a dizzying emotional crisis. Lila Mae was real, tangible, and living just miles away. Clara knew she had to see her, to understand what kind of woman could inspire such words, what kind of competition she was facing. She drove by Mrs. Gable's small, dilapidated house, half hidden by overgrown cypress trees. The house looked charmingly neglected, with a small, well-tended garden hinting at the occupant's gentle touch. When Clara finally saw her, standing on the porch, shaking out a small braided rug, the observation was devastating. Lila Mae was everything Clara was not, effortlessly elegant, with a cascade of dark, shiny hair and a quiet, unassuming beauty that spoke of inner peace. She looked like a woman who naturally understood eternal things, a woman who didn't need a stolen letter to feel special. Clara drove away quickly, a knot of pure jealousy and fear tightening in her chest. The crisis wasn't external yet. Elias hadn't met Lila Mae, or so he implied, as he spoke only of their relationship through the letters. The internal conflict, however, became unbearable. Clara now saw herself as a cheap forgery, a woman trying to wear a dress that was cut for another. This access to the subconscious was overwhelming. The fear that Elias loved only the reflection of L.M. that Clara provided. The next time she met Elias, the conversation felt strained on her end. He noticed immediately. Something is wrong, L.M., he observed, his voice soft but insistent. You are looking out at the river, but you are seeing an ocean of worry. Clara had to conjure a lie that honored the depth of their false connection. I am wrestling, she whispered, looking him straight in his river-silt eyes, with the complexity of possession. When does a discovery become a claim, and when does a claim become a theft? The philosophical cover story bought Clara time, but it also forced her to dig deeper into the ethics of her theft. The emotional resonance of their conversations continued to grow, making the idea of confessing or simply disappearing unbearable. Elias, sensing her turmoil, began to write a new letter for her, composing it aloud during one of their secret meetings. I see a tension in you, he murmured, his gaze tracing the worry lines on her forehead. The battle between the person you were before the truth arrived and the person you must become now that you hold it. That old self, he continued, is a ghost you must finally bid farewell. The irony was a bitter, choking thing. His words, intended to encourage her to embrace her true self, the L.M. he believed her to be, were instead encouraging her to bury the real Clara Bell deeper beneath the lies. The intensity of this creative synergy, where his genius fueled her deception, became dangerously addictive. She loved the way his mind worked, the way he framed ordinary concepts in extraordinary ways. She realized the fundamental difference between the letter he wrote and the letter she received. The letter she read was a complete, self-contained entity. The man she now knew was a brilliant, but profoundly lonely soul seeking completion. He wasn't waiting for a philosophical genius. He was waiting for the woman he had imagined in his letters. And Clara, the simple store clerk, was capable of embodying that imagination. The interesting conflict now lay in a terrifying prediction. If Elias met the real Lila Mae, would she live up to the standard set by the stolen letters? And if she did, what would become of Clara? The answer, she feared, was that Clara would revert to the dust motes in the general store, invisible once more. She resolved to find a way to intervene, to ensure that Elias's reality remained the beautiful fantasy she had created with him. Clara's resolve hardened into a dangerous strategic impulse. She needed to understand the nature of the communication between Elias and Lila May before the Sentinel Oak meeting. Given that Lila May was a teacher, Clara knew she wouldn't be at Mrs. Gable's house during the day. One sweltering Thursday afternoon, Clara drove to Lila May's rented house. She felt like a character in one of the Gothic novels Elias loved, driven by a desperate, fateful curiosity. The door was unlocked, a common, careless habit in Harmony Creek. Stepping inside felt like walking into a sacred, forbidden space. The air was cool, smelling faintly of old paper and lilac. The house was sparsely furnished, but meticulously organized. On the small writing desk, tucked beneath a heavy glass paperweight, Clara found what she was looking for. A small stack of envelopes, cream-colored, sealed with the same falling star wax. The first letter, the one Elias had mentioned, was there. Her hands trembling, Clara picked it up, feeling a wave of guilt and adrenaline. She didn't open it. She only scanned the return address label, a P.O. box in New Orleans, and realized Elias had only recently moved to Harmony Creek. The most damning item was Lila May's response. It was a single, folded sheet of lined paper, addressed to Elias, but clearly not sent yet. Clara unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, but pedestrian. The content was brief and chillingly formal. Lila May thanked Elias for his kind, unusual note, but stated that while she appreciated his intellectual approach to acquaintance, she was not currently in a position to pursue such a serious emotional correspondence, and suggested he find a local circle of writers. The words were polite, dismissive, and utterly lacking in the philosophical depth Elias craved. The real L.M. had rejected him. The discovery was a dizzying, emotional high. Lila May Carson hadn't rejected the man. She had rejected the idea of him, the sheer, unbearable intensity of his soul. She hadn't been worthy of his poetry. This wasn't theft. It was custodianship. Clara felt an immediate, self-righteous justification for her actions. She wasn't standing in the way of a fated love. She was rescuing a profound soul from devastating indifference. She quickly resealed the rejection letter and placed it back on the desk, feeling strangely protected by the knowledge that the original L.M. was a historical footnote, not a present danger. Her connection with Elias was now, paradoxically, the only true path for his beautiful words. The creative synergy between them, fueled by this new knowledge, soared to new heights. She was freer now to create the perfect L.M. the woman Elias deserved. The emotional power of this justification was addictive, a deep access to the subconscious that whispered, "This is destiny, not deceit." The conflicts had narrowed now. The battle was no longer if she should tell him the truth, but when and how to construct a narrative that allowed him to see her, Clara, as the true destination of his heart's journey. She decided to raise the stakes, to give their relationship a tangible, public-facing anchor. She invited Elias to the general store on a slow Sunday, not to buy anything, but simply to observe the life you have chosen to escape. This was a huge step, moving him from the isolation of his cabin to the center of Clara's mundane, public world. Elias was reluctant but intrigued by Clara's invitation to visit the general store. He arrived precisely at noon on Sunday, a time when only a few churchgoers stopped by for a forgotten gallon of milk. Seeing him standing beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights, surrounded by cans of soup and bags of feed, was jarring. He looked like a masterpiece hung in a barn. The simple setting forced him out of his philosophical reverie and into the real world, and this created a beautiful new tension in their dynamic. He observed the people of Harmony Creek, Miss Elspeth buying her weekly paper, old Mr. Hemmings haggling over the price of a rope, with the detached but sharp eye of a true writer. He didn't mock them. He saw the profound, quiet dignity in their routines. They are all writing a silent epic, he mused to Clara. The narrative of persistence. For Clara, this meeting was about grounding their connection. She was showing him, this is my reality. Can you still love the self that exists here? Their conversation shifted from abstract philosophy to concrete, shared observations which felt even more intimate. They were building a life, not just an idea. The external conflict, however, was about to rear its head, delivered, ironically, by Miss Elspeth. Miss Elspeth, never one to miss a beat or a handsome stranger, approached their corner of the store. Well, bless my heart, if it ain't Elias Vance. You're looking better than when you first moved in. I hear you're the poet fella. Been renting Mrs. Gable's old fishing shack? Ain't you? Elias smiled politely. I am. And you must be the keeper of the town's history. Miss Elspeth chuckled, then turned her full, knowing gaze on Clara. I tell you what, Clara Bell, that handsome man ought to be sweet-talking that poor schoolteacher, Lila May, who lives just down the road from him, not you. She's the one who gets those fancy sealed letters. Not that I gossip, mind you. But you know. Miss Elspeth paused, her eyes flickering between Elias and Clara, a triumphant, gossip-fueled spark lighting her face. The air went instantly cold, despite the summer heat. Elias's easy smile vanished, replaced by a look of bewildered confusion, like a man who had suddenly woken up in a strange room. The emotional current that had flowed so effortlessly between them seized up. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, her carefully constructed world dissolving faster than sugar in hot coffee. Miss Elspeth, oblivious to the emotional bomb she had just dropped, walked away satisfied, leaving a silence that screamed louder than any accusation. Elias stared at Clara, his river-silt eyes now dark with suspicion and a deep, agonizing betrayal. Sealed letters, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of everything Clara had stolen. Lila May, down the road. He didn't need to ask the question. The pieces of the puzzle were fitting together for him with sickening speed. The vague address, the mention of the tea, the confusion on his face when Clara had brought it up. It all made sense. He hadn't just met his L.M. He had met a woman who had intercepted the communication. Clara knew that any attempt to lie now would only make it worse. This was the moment of reckoning, the climax of her long, reckless journey. She had to choose between a final, desperate lie and a painful, redemptive truth. The truth, for once, felt like the only way to save the core of what they had built. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the original, cream-colored letter, still crisp with the scent of vanilla and ink, and laid it on the worn counter between them. I was only going to look up the address, she confessed, the words tasting like dust. It wasn't meant for me, but I read it, and I saw myself truly, for the first time, in your words. I am Clara Bell, Elias, the woman who opened the letter that wasn't meant for her. The revelation hung between them, a tangible, suffocating weight. Elias didn't pick up the letter. He only stared at it, then at Clara, the hurt in his eyes so profound it felt like a physical wound. His confusion slowly morphed into a controlled, cold anger. You read it, he articulated, each word a slow, painful chisel. And you came to the Sentinel. You let me believe everything. All those weeks. All those conversations about the sanctity of truth and the tragedy of pretense. It was all a performance? A stolen identity? His voice rose slightly on the last phrase, the pain finally cracking the surface of his composure. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, but she held them back. This was not the time for tears. It was the time for brutal honesty. "It wasn't a performance to me, Elias," she insisted, leaning across the counter, her voice earnest. "It was the only way I could breathe. I read your heart on that page and I knew the real L.M. would never appreciate it. She's a good woman, a lovely schoolteacher, but she doesn't see the geometry of longing. I know that because I saw her letter to you, the one where she politely dismissed your soul and told you to find a local writing group. She hadn't meant to reveal Lila May's rejection, but the words tumbled out, a desperate, final defense." Elias recoiled slightly, the new piece of information hitting him with an unexpected force. The betrayal from Clara was one thing. The confirmation that his profoundest offering had been brushed aside by the intended recipient was another, a deep primary sting. The sudden complexity of the situation paralyzed him.